Well, thank you very much all for coming. And as you have gathered, having a slightly odd moment because the book is all done, but it's not available yet for sale until the 20th of November. It seems it's sitting there in the warehouse. It will be available on the 20th of November. So I'm very grateful to Anya and Oliver for their invitation to give a second talk on Vanbrugh this year. My first in April was about the book, which is being published by Lund Humphreys, and it focused really on his key aspects of his life. This time, I'm also talking on one of the themes of the book, but one which I did not have an opportunity to write about at any length, which is how Vanbrugh's architecture was regarded, both during his lifetime, when it was mostly detested, and then during the course of the later 18th century and through into the early 19th century, when it first began to be understood and properly appreciated. So I showed the Kit Kat Club portrait. The portrait gallery obviously doesn't allow very good reproductions. Now, I had hoped when I first suggested the topic that I might be able to bring the story up to the 20th century. But in working on it, I've realized that Vanbrugh's 18th century reputation is by itself an immense subject. So I hope you will not mind if I stick to that, leaving Vanbrugh's 20th century reputation to a third lecture another time. So I'm going to start in 1700, when Vanbrugh was making plans for Castle Howard. In July 1700, Vanbrugh was given permission to build a house in amongst the ruins of Whitehall Palace, on Whitehall, a house which survived reasonably intact through to the end of the 19th century, when it was demolished to be replaced by the War Office. I show first a drawing which, don't worry, it's very hard to read. You'll get a better image in a minute of it. So the first is a drawing in the so-called Vanbrugh album in the V&A, not, I think, by Vanbrugh himself. And since it shows the more Palladian wings added after he got married in 1719, not dating from the time that it was built. But it demonstrates, if you can see it, that you'll see it again, I think. I can't remember quite which ones we've been allowed to borrow for the exhibition. But this drawing demonstrates he'd already developed a taste for slightly exaggerated rustication. Now, you can get a much better view of Goose Pie House from the drawing which was made by John Soane's office for one of his Royal Academy lectures, which demonstrates that the house was already well known as an example of Vanbrugh's work in the early 19th century and sufficiently well regarded by Soane to be used as a representative example of Vanbrugh's style. I also show you, very interestingly, a surviving photograph of it taken sometime in the late 19th century when it was a museum for the United Service Institute, before it was demolished in 1898 to make way for the War Office. Now, there was something about this house, or maybe it was something about Vanbrugh himself, which seems to particularly irritated contemporaries. An anonymous poet leapt into print, accusing him of all sorts of vices, of which his house was used as a characteristic example. In love and friendship false, to all unjust, active and passive in both sexes' lust. The author of this quib, unnamed, goes on to suggest that Vanbrugh ignored all the normal rules of propriety in his buildings, as in his conversation and poetry. If yet you know him not, whene'er you see a thing that's in its nature mean, 'tis he. In conversation, building, poetry, he knows no sense, nor place, nor unity. On he goes. Why, even the buildings by itself betrayed, itself confesseth for what use 'twas made, itself the emblem of your darling sin. No other way but only backwards in, betrays your genius, and too plainly shows within your veins what beastly passion flows. Jonathan Swift, at this stage of his life, a little-known Irish clergyman, had spent a lot of time in the 1690s acting as the amanuensis to Sir William Temple, also wrote a poem inveighing against Vanbragh's house, first published in 1703, and then in an enlarged version in 1708. He thought Vanbrugh took his inspiration from small boys building mud huts. When he found the boys at play and saw them dabbling in their clay, he stood behind a stall to learn and marked the progress of their work. With true delight, observed them all raking up mud to build a wall. The plan he much admired and took the model in his table book, thought himself now exactly skilled, and so resolved a house to build, a real house, with rooms and stairs 5 times at least as big as theirs. So what was it about Vanbrugh that caused such offence to his contemporaries? I think it's worth remembering that in 1700 he was only known as a writer of 2 plays, The Relapse and The Provoked Wife, which had been extremely successful. This was maybe what irritated people, but which were also regarded as obscene, so much so that the actors at both Drury Lane and Lincoln's Inn Fields, the 2 theatres at the time, faced prosecution in 1700 for plays, including The Provoked Wife, which were described in the wording of the prosecution as full of profane, irreverent, lewd, indecent, and immoral expressions. It showed the opening page of the 1697 edition of The Relapse. A campaign was being waged by the clergy, led by the non-juring clergyman Jeremy Collier, here he is, and the recently established Society for the Reformation of Manners to clean up the theatre. Vanbrugh was described as a man who had debauched the stage beyond the looseness of all former times, and so was a particular target for their wrath. Some of their anger was deflected, I think, from a moral disapproval of his plays to views of his architecture. Now, if there was a view, which there seems to have been, on the part of these moralizing poets that Vanbrugh was a bit too pleased with himself, a bit cocky, then this view was definitely shared by Sarah, Duchess of Marlborough. She never warmed to him, maybe partly because he always regarded the Duke as his client for Blenheim, and he was inclined to be willfully offhand with the Duchess when she began to interfere, which she did from very near the beginning of the construction of Blenheim. I think he had the sort of temperament which was good with men he liked, friends and fellow members of the Kit Kat Club, with whom he was inclined to be jocular. But this attitude, maybe for good reasons, got at the nose of those who were not members of the club. Now, I'm not going to dwell in any detail on Vanbragh's argument with the Duchess of Marlborough, which I've dealt with in my book. Suffice it to say that she never wanted Vanbrugh to be architect of Blenheim. She and Queen Anne wanted Wren to take it on and sought his advice on several occasions, not least in the summer of 1705, when he was asked to look into the likely costs of the project and rightly predicted that it would cost vastly much more than the Duchess and the Earl of Godolphin expected. Nor was the Duchess alone in her views. When the Duke showed the plan for Blenheim to the Earl of Aylesbury in September 1705, he recorded that he thought, "By the plan I saw, that the house is like one mass of stone without taste or relish. Now, Blenheim in particular attracted eager and curious visitors from the moment that construction began in the summer of 1705. I'm going to show a print of it rather than a modern photograph. For example, the Duke of Shrewsbury, who was regarded with good reason as an architectural expert, having been educated in Paris in the 1670s, had recently spent nearly 4 years in Rome, visited in May 1706 with his Italian wife, and he wrote a letter to the Duke of Marlborough reporting on the progress of work. Here's the Duke of Shrewsbury. He described how the house is yet so low that as to that particular, we understood more by what we saw at Kensington. He'd been one of the people who'd been consulted about the model of Blenheim. So when he says what we saw at Kensington, it was the wooden model which they had all studied, analysed, and supported. Then by anything is yet to be discovered here. But the gardens are so noble, and as far as I can discover at the first view, so perfectly well laid out, that they will far surpass anything I've seen in England. And if the difficulty of the approach can be well got over, they were still quarrelling about how you arrived at the house, because if you came from Oxford, you came to the side rather than to the front. As I hope it will, there's no doubt but the situation is the best could have been chosen, and that view upon the river when cut into canals is beyond anything could have been seen from those places where some great critics would have placed the house. In short, it puts one in mind of Sir William Temple's description of a seat, that it ought to have down, wood, and water. As I've said, he was one of the small group of people whose views had been canvassed when the model had been shown to the Queen in Kensington Palace the previous September. And so he would have known that there had been, and indeed still was, a certain amount of discussion as to where exactly in Woodstock Park the house should have been placed, whether close to the water, or as Vanbrugh had suggested, up on the brow of the hill with a good view northwards. Shrewsbury was there again in August 1706, and he wrote again to the Duke of Marlborough how, "I was yesterday at Blenheim. The garden is in great beauty. This wet season has fallen out well for the young trees, few of them having miscarried. That side of the house your Grace designs for your and my Lady Duchess's private apartments is raised to almost the top of the windows of the first story. I could not go up to see how it is disposed on the inside, but the stonework without seems very strong and beautiful. The park is now the charmingest thing I ever saw. I should be heartily glad you were, according to your own desire, at the end of what you labour for abroad." But basically, the Duke of Marlborough was endlessly hoping that he was able to stop fighting overseas and come back and live at Blenheim. Later in the month, the Duke wrote back, thanking him for his report, telling him how, "I'm much obliged to your Grace for the visits you make to Blenheim. The account you are pleased to give of it, you may believe, makes me long to be there. The misfortune is I can only see it at the greatest disadvantage in the winter. But I hope the time will come when I may be so happy as to enjoy your Grace's good company there in the most agreeable season." The Duke of Shrewsbury was building a house nearby Heathrow. Shrewsbury accompanied the Duke on one of his periodic lightning visits to inspect the progress of work when he was back in England over Christmas in 1707. But when it came to the choice of an architect to design a new house at Heathrow, he used not Vanbrugh, but Thomas Archer, who had himself spent time in Rome and was presumably regarded as more knowledgeable about European architecture. According to Alexander Pope, writing much later in 1717, it was the Duke of Shrewsbury who coined the phrase that Blenheim was a great quarry of stones above ground, which indicates that then as now, people were perfectly capable of being polite about a project one day and rude about it the next. was not just friends of the Marlboroughs who visited Blenheim to inspect the progress of works, but tourists. In September 1710, Zacharias Conrad von Uffenbach, a German bibliophile, visited and wrote a long and, I think, very interesting critique of it. He was told that the building had already cost £800,000, a grotesque exaggeration, but an indication that the immense cost of the project was a topic of both widespread discussion and criticism. He was impressed by the scale of the project and the number of people at work. He reckoned 800. Actually, an underestimate. It reminded him of the Tower of Babel. He went on to comment on how, at a distance or from the side, it makes a poor impression on account of its many terraces, turrets, and other features. It does not consist of a corps de logis and two symmetrical wings, but of a number of parts projecting one in front of the other, which gives it almost the appearance of a theatre, and are uncommonly imposing when viewed from in front of the right facade of the house. In other respects, the building appears very low because of the quite extraordinary strength and thickness of the walls and decorations, which are mostly à la rustique. One cannot help wondering at the enormous stone employed for this structure. The columns of the two great portals in front and behind are 4 foot in diameter. The rooms, although very numerous, are all extremely small, and the windows, which are all high up as in a church, are also very small and seem still smaller on account of their height. Now, many of these comments, I think, are not unreasonable. It's true that it is hard to get a feeling for the building as a whole if one approaches it, as most people did and do today, from Oxford. But it's much more impressive when viewed from the front, when one gets a better sense of the immensity of its structure. As Uffenbach describes it, the extraordinary strength and thickness of the walls and decorations. I'm going to show a modern photograph. I thought that I was going to show one by David Walensky, who took the photographs for my book, but this is actually one by me. What impressed von Uffenbach even more than the scale of the house was the enormous bridge being constructed in front of it. This is a photograph by Walensky. This must be the most expensive and unnecessary bridge ever built in the world. You have to remember the valley was flooded, so originally there was just a little stream. This must be the most expensive and unnecessary bridge ever built in the world. The bridge is entirely composed of squared stone of prodigious proportions, and in this respect, it doubtless surpasses any bridge anywhere. It consists of 3 arches, the centre one of which is 100 foot long and 40 foot high, an astounding size. Other visitors at the time were no more polite. Thomas Cave, a reactionary Tory MP and owner of Stamford Hall in Leicestershire, visited in September 1711 and dismissed it as a great house with little rooms and less for cost. The gardens are large and in good order, but not the prettiest. There are some foreign statues and marbles, very curious, but not set up. The following year, 1712, Samuel Molyneux, a recent graduate of Trinity College, Dublin, wrote at greater length that the grand portico is, in my opinion, clumsy and crowded. Maybe I should go back to it. The several towers in the building extremely Gothic and superfluous. The great face to the avenue surprisingly odd, in my opinion. The round sweep of the pillars on either side the portico, not reaching up above halfway of the whole height, and the square building appearing backwards above it. The statues, too, are placed over these pillars, are very clumsy and ugly. Molyneux did at least allow that the house had some virtues if viewed from a distance, describing how, upon the whole, I must confess, this front at a distance, where its minuter faults and virtues are not discernible, does indeed appear noble and magnificent enough, and he also admired the bridge, which he described as extremely large and noble. So now, much the most brutal criticism of Blenheim during Vanbragh's lifetime came, perhaps not surprisingly, from Alexander Pope, who was always inclined to waspishness, would anyway have been a political enemy of Vanbrugh. He visited in 1717 and wrote immediately afterwards how, "I never saw so great a thing with so much littleness in it. I think the architect built it entirely in complaisance to the taste of its owners, for it is the most inhospitable thing imaginable and the most selfish. When you look upon the outside, you would think it large enough for a prince. When you see the inside, it is too little for a subject. It has not conveniency to lodge a common family." It's not quite true. It is a house of entries and passages, amongst which there are 3 vistas through the whole, very uselessly handsome. There is what might have been a fine gallery, but spoilt by 2 arches towards the end of it, which take away the sight of several of the windows. At the top of the building are several cupolas and little turrets that have but an ill effect and make the building look at once finical and heavy. The 2 sides of the building are entirely spoilt by 2 monstrous bow windows, which stand just in the middle instead of doors. And as if it were fatal that some trifling littleness should everywhere destroy the grandeur, there are in the chief front 2 semicircles of a lower structure than the rest that cut off the angles and look as if they were purposely designed to hide a loftier and nobler piece of building, the top of which appears above them. In a word, the whole is a most expensive absurdity. So it seems that, so far as I can find, no one had a good word for Vanbrugh during his lifetime. Yet, interestingly, even though he had fallen out so spectacularly with the Duchess of Marlborough, in spite of the fact that Blenheim had cost vastly much more than had originally been estimated, and the Masons were suing not only the Duke and Duchess, but Vanbrugh as well, for the back payment of money that was owed them, he went on getting major commissions for new building projects. Vast new wings and a banqueting hall for the house he had sold his friend, the Duke of Newcastle at Claremont. So if there's a point, so this was Vanbragh's little house, which he built for himself in 1709 when he was complaining that he had no money. And then he sold it to the Duke of Newcastle, who had lots of money, and the Duke of Newcastle got Vanbrugh to add these simply immense wings. And then even in spite of the fact that he had added these immense wings, he suddenly realized he needed a banqueting hall. So he added an absolutely massive banqueting hall at the back, and that's the Belvedere, which is what still survives, which you can see with difficulty, not in the part of the garden which is run by the National Trust. So this is all post-Blenheim. He added a grand new entrance front at Grimsthorpe for his old friend Robert Bertie, with whom he had travelled to The Hague in 1688 to help William of Orange make preparations for his invasion, who had now become the Duke of Lancaster. He built a massive house in open land between Salisbury and Blandford Forum for the plutocrat George Doddington. He built a host of new garden buildings for Lord Cobham at Stowe, and a big house for Admiral Delaval in Northumberland. So I think maybe this could have been partly what annoyed people about Vanbrugh. However much things had gone wrong in some of his building projects, including most especially the Queen's Theatre Haymarket, he went on getting huge projects from his friends, the circle of Whigs who had been members of the Kit Kat Club, the super-rich who were back in power after the accession of George I. When the Duke of Marlborough had shown the Marquis of Aylesbury the designs for Blenheim, Aylesbury had commented, "I suppose, my lord, you made choice of him because he is a professed Whig." I used to be a bit sceptical of there being an overt political aspect to the design of these great new country houses built after the Revolution of 1688. But they were statements of new wealth and political authority, flaunting their sense of entitlement, their social and political ambition, and they made many people, particularly backwoods Tory MPs, Tory satirists and poets, and the new generation of tastemakers, extremely angry. Now, as often happens in the history of taste, attitudes to Vanbrugh began to change almost as soon as he was dead. The year after Vanbrugh's death, in March 1726, Jonathan Swift and Alexander Pope wrote a joint preface to their prose miscellanies in which they expressed regret for having been so rude about him during his lifetime. In regard to two persons only, we wish our raillery, though ever so tender, or resentment, though ever so just, had not been indulged. We speak of Sir John Vanbrugh, who was a man of wit and of honour, and of Mr. Addison, whose name deserves all respect from every lover of learning. Joseph Spence remembered that Pope thought Garth, Vanbrugh, and Congreve were the three most honest-hearted and good men of the poetical members of the Kit Kat Club, and that none of our writers have a freer, easier way for comedy than Etheridge and Vanbrugh. Now, admittedly, this was about Vanbrugh's virtues as a playwright, not as an architect. But I think it's often hard to disentangle the two. Visitors to Blenheim were inclined to be a bit more generous in their response to it once it had been completed than when it was under construction. For example, Daniel Defoe viewed it, as Vanbrugh had intended, not as a private house, but a national monument and a source of patriotic pride. The magnificence of the building does not here, as at Cannons, at Chatsworth, and at other palaces of the nobility, express the genius and the opulence of the possessor, but it represents the bounty, the gratitude, or what else posterity pleases to call it, of the English nation to the man whom they delighted to honour. William Stukely, the antiquarian, likewise viewed Blenheim as a gift from a grateful nation, writing also in 1724 how it was a vast and magnificent pile of building, a royal gift to the high merit of the invincible Duke of Marlborough. But for most people in the early 18th century, Blenheim, I think, was regarded as being on too large a scale. They may have admired the park, the bridge, and the planting, but they found the scale of the house indigestible. As Lady Hervey wrote in 1748, was an emblem of him for whom it was built, an edifice that ornaments the country but has plundered the people. A great house, but not a good one. So now, what was it that caused critical attitudes to Vanbrugh to change? The first sign of a change in attitude to Vanbrugh's work that I've found came from Robert Adams' younger brother, James. I'm not sure, James, who held forth, it was reported rather boringly, about the compositional virtues of Blenheim when he was travelling back to Edinburgh with Alexander Carlyle, John Hume, and William Robertson in April 1758. Though he did not say that Sir John Vanbrugh's design was faultless, yet he said it ill deserved the aspersions laid upon it, for he had seen few palaces where there was more movement, as he called it, than in Blenheim. For some reason, either because they were more sympathetic than most of their contemporaries to Vanbragh's castle style, or because they had been influenced by the ideas of their Edinburgh philosophical contemporaries, both Robert and James Adam could see the virtues of Vanbragh's style of architecture, and they defended it in their works in architecture, in which they described how Vanbrugh was a great man whose reputation as an architect has long been carried down the stream by a torrent of undistinguishing prejudice and abuse. Sir John Vanbragh's genius was of the first class, and in point of movement, novelty, and ingenuity, his works have not been exceeded by anything in modern times. In some ways, one can see why the Adam brothers admired Vanbrugh. They were interested in the idea of picturesque composition, and they were eclectic in their tastes. More surprising is the fact that their contemporary and great adversary, Sir William Chambers, also spoke very well of Vanbrugh in what was to have been the third of a series of lectures he planned to give at the Royal Academy in the early 1770s. Chambers wrote how the French and the Italians have a method of rendering the most trifling composition considerable, which Vanbrugh, alone amongst the English, has ventured to imitate. However faulty Vanbrugh may have been in other respects, it is certain that his method of decorating the chimney shafts, raising turrets, and surrounding his buildings with terraces, bastions, gates, obelisks, etc., the like, gives an air of grandeur and novelty to his compositions that will always be admired by men of true judgment. It's interesting because Chambers was not known for his generosity towards other architects, and he was generally exceptionally doctrinaire in his tastes. So there must have been something in the zeitgeist which caused architects to look at Vanbragh's work differently, recognizing its ambition and sense of scale, what Chambers commends as its grandeur and novelty. What seems to have happened is that during the course of the 1760s and 1770s, at the time that the Royal Academy was established, people started to look at architecture and discuss its characteristics in a more professionally critical way. Vanbrugh began to be admired for precisely those qualities for which, during his lifetime, he had been condemned: his freedom of invention, his willingness to break the rules, most of all, his capacity for picturesque composition. One can see this change of taste in the writings of Horace Walpole, who was always alert to changes in public attitude. When he first published his Anecdotes of Painting in England, Walpole simply reproduced George Virtue's damning words about Vanbrugh. He wanted eyes, he wanted all ideas of proposition, convenience, propriety. He undertook vast designs and composed heaps of littleness. He broke through all rule and compensated for it by no imagination. But when 10 years later Walpole visited Castle Howard, he was bowled over by its sense of scale and the sublime. He saw a palace, a town, a fortified city, temples on high places, woods worthy of being each a metropolis of the Druids, vales connected to hills by other woods, the noblest lawn in the world, fenced by half the horizon, and a mausoleum that would tempt one to be buried alive. In short, I've seen gigantic places before, but never a sublime one. Joshua Reynolds, who was a friend of Horace Walpole, picked up on this idea that Vanbrugh was good at composing buildings from a distance, as if he was a painter, when he came to write his 13th discourse in 1786. Reynolds praised Vanbragh's originality of invention, and he added how he understood light and shadow and had great skill in composition. So this is indeed a turn-up for the books. Reynolds did not pretend to be an architectural critic, and indeed there are very few references to architecture in his writings. But he was presumably attentive to the mood of the time and how taste was changing, recognizing that Vanbrugh's originality of invention was something now to admire rather than criticize. And his choice of words in what he thought was admirable is also interesting. It was Vanbrugh's skill in composition which was to be admired, as if he composed his buildings like a painter, attending carefully to effects of light and shadow, the essence of the picturesque. This was the critical milieu that the young John Soane must have enjoyed as one of the early students at the Royal Academy schools in the early 1770s, when he was working for Henry Holland and before he went off to Rome on a Royal Academy scholarship. He came to give his series of lectures following his election as the Academy's Professor of Architecture in 1806. For Soane, Vanbrugh was someone he hugely admired. He described him in a lecture given in January 1810 as the Shakespeare of architects, the highest possible praise. He went on to say, "We must not seek in his work the simple elegance of the antique. He possesses a great portion of the fire and the boldness, power, force, expression, marked character of Michelangelo and Bernini. But he wants the softness and delicacy of Palladio and his best followers. Still, his works are and must be objects of high consideration with the young artists, and for invention, he has yet had no equal in this country." Soane arranged for his lectures, as I've already shown, to be illustrated with big watercolors prepared by his office, which will take pride of place in the exhibition at the Soane Museum, which opens in the first week of March, just in time for the celebrations of his tercentenary on March 26th. I'm going to end this talk. I could go on, but I'm not going to. End this talk with 3 different images of Blenheim by Soane's office, which were prepared, presumably as a sequence, to show the way that Blenheim was mass. Unfortunately, these don't show up as well in reproduction as they do in real life. The first was a relatively conventional view of Blenheim's north front. The second shows the building half abstracted, presumably to draw attention to the way it had been composed. And the third shows all detail dissolved, a ghostly image of the outline of the building from a distance as a free composition. I think these 3 images give a very clear view as to what it was that Soane was encouraging his students to look at and admire: the sense of a building as a free and abstract composition, dominated by an idea of mass, with the power of evocation entirely independent of orthodox classicism. So now I hope that a close examination of the ways in which Vanbrugh's work was both admired and sometimes reviled in the 18th century does help one to understand his great importance in the history of architecture. He was not in any way an orthodox classicist, but he viewed his buildings in free and abstract terms, intended to evoke an emotional as much as an intellectual response. During his lifetime, this approach to architecture was regarded with deep suspicion, if not hostility, as being both unconventional and anti-classical. But a century later, in the high noon of Romanticism, his architecture was now viewed with the deepest admiration, particularly by architects, for its originality, its extreme vigor, and its compositional freedom. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Charles. It's a wonderful lecture, and what a wonderful picture to end on. Before we take questions, which I hope you're happy to do, I should say that this lecture and a lecture next Tuesday by Christine Stevenson on Vanbrugh's clients form a sort of prequel to Vanbrugh 300, a celebration of Vanbrugh's life to take place in 2026, which more details forthcoming, a website soon to be sent to you probably at the end of the month, and more details to come to all members of the Georgian group and friends. But perhaps we could take some questions for Charles. Yes.
Is there any evidence that he actually did any of the drawing himself, any design work? Is there any surviving evidence?
Yes, you'll see it all in March. I mean, it's interesting. So one of the things which lies behind the exhibition at the Soane, there are 3 big groups of drawings by Vanbrugh, all in the V&A, and they're perfectly well known. They're available. You can look at them online. But for some reason, which I think I understand, they're regarded as sketches and not very good. And that's because they are sketches. They're not finished drawings. And my general view, in the 50s, there was a man called Carrie Downes. He was mad about Hawksmoor and did a PhD at the Courtauld on Hawksmoor and catalogued all of Hawksmoor's drawings. And he realized, which is absolutely true, that Hawksmoor was a wonderful draftsman. And he created a view that Vanbrugh wasn't very good at drawing. I mean, Vanbrugh wasn't as good at drawing it as Hawksmoor was, but he invented the idea that sort of Vanbrugh wasn't very good at doing what he was supposed to be doing. And he needed Hawksmoor to do all the detailed work. And of course, like all these things, there's some truth in it. But actually, if you go through the drawings, I mean, I found it incredibly helpful going through the drawings for the exhibition at the Soane, because a lot of them seem to have come from his office, and they're rough sketches. Many of them are rough sketches done at the end of his life. But when you look at them, what you realize is that they are rough sketches by somebody who could draw pretty well and quite freely and very inventively. Now, my view is that people don't develop that skill late in life. You know, you're either good at drawing, well, it's an oversimplification, but in general, I think you're either good at drawing and you do it naturally as a child. You can learn it to an extent, but you can't learn that sort of free, very inventive drawing easily. So that my view now is that if he could draw like that and did draw very freely and very inventively late in his life, he must have been able to do it earlier on. And in fact, if you read his letters, it's obvious. He writes to a friend of his, the Earl of Manchester, on Christmas Day 1699, saying that he's gone up and stayed in all the smart country houses which he was able to invite himself to stay in order to show the sketches of what he proposed for Cockerell. Now, people have sort of thought, well, that there are 2 sketches of Cockerell which emerged in the 1990s. I think he drew naturally and was perfectly able, as many architects are, to communicate his ideas about what a house would look like through drawing. And that's different from what Hawksmoor did, which was very detailed, very beautiful, finished drawing. So they're different in kind and character.
Thank you.
Perhaps, yes, Paul.
Did architecture take over from theatre
did he carry on with his theatrical interests and his writing and his producing later in life when he was?
Yeah, I should say before I answer this question, sitting in the front row is Rory Fraser, who's in the middle of finishing a straight biography. I mean, mine is half a biography, but not a complete biography. And so, I mean, he can comment. To an extent, I hadn't realised, even though I've written a book about Castle Howard, is that after he did the general view which I inherited is he did the Relaxed and Provoked Wife, and then he designed Castle Howard, and then he did Blenheim. But actually, he carried on writing plays while he was doing Castle Howard, and then he took on the commission. Well, he invented the commission for himself of doing a huge, great theatre in Haymarket. I mean, it was far bigger than the existing theatre. That was the incredible commitment. And then not only did he open this vast theatre, which was on such a scale that nobody could hear the actors, but he was also responsible for all the production. So in 1705 and 1706, I mean, Rory and I have talked about this because he's doing so much that it's actually quite hard to write about because, one day he's at Blenheim supervising the workmen, and the next day he's opening the latest production of one of his plays in his own theatre, in the Queen's Theatre. I mean, he gives it up after about 18 months, but that 18 months is key, and he's still involved, and he still is writing about what's going on in the theatre later on in his life. I mean, he was one of the people behind the Academy of Music, which was set up in 1718. So what makes him interesting, but also complicated, and it's also one of the reasons why I think, if I'm honest, Carrie Downes took the view that, if you were doing plays, you couldn't have also been doing architecture. And that therefore he must have got Hawksmoor to do all the work for him while he did the plays. But I think he was versatile and he did a lot. He was very energetic.
Yes, Edward.
Yeah. Can I follow that a little further and say the creative brain behind his early plays and the creative brain behind his approach to architecture? Can you see the common themes? And you spent a long time studying him, his personality, and his ways of creating.
I haven't spent a long time studying the nature of the relationship, which you rightly raised, between the kind of mindset in the writing of the plays and the architecture. And that's because I did a chapter of my PhD on that, which was rejected by the Georgian group journal. and which nobody ever thought was remotely convincing. So I'm afraid I'm leaving that to Rory. But what I do, I mean, the reason I use as a subheading for the book, The Drama for Architecture, is that I think, he is the same person. One day he's at the Queen's Theatre Haymarket, and the next day he's at Blenheim. I mean, I hadn't registered when I wrote the book that very interesting thing of Conrad von Uffenbach saying that he thinks that Blenheim is like a theatre, because unfortunately, it's very hard to work out, or I'm not sufficiently expert to know about the nature of how much in being involved in theatre productions he was involved in commissioning the scenery. So that I don't think you can say very precisely, and I don't try to in the book, what the nature of the relationship is. What I do is show that he was very, very actively still involved in the theatre during the time, certainly that he was designing Castle Howard, but also Blenheim. And there's a theatrical aspect. That's why I think the later 18th century criticism and commentary is really interesting because, you know, these people were looking at it with care and thought because it was the early stages of architectural criticism. And they were very admiring of it in a way that the previous generation hadn't been.
Yes, Mark.
No.
I think I'm right in saying that 2 or 3 of Vanbrugh's houses are illustrated in Vitruvius Britannicus.
Yeah.
1715 onwards. What kind of commentary does Colin Campbell make?
So it's an extremely good question, which, as you probably correctly anticipated, I'm not going to be able completely to answer because Vitruvius Britannicus is published in 1715, the first volume, and has always been assumed to be a kind of manifesto for a new taste in architecture. But, as you correctly say, incredibly prominently illustrated with double-page spreads and filling the volume are works by Vanbrugh, so that there is an ambiguity. I mean, I think there may be people in the audience who can answer this question better than I can. I think Colin Campbell was probably, like lots of people are, on the one hand, doing a big glossy, the equivalent of a big glossy volume about all the best buildings in England, Britannicus, Britain. Not surprisingly, he shows the 2 biggest examples. But then when he comes down to write the introduction, he writes it with the Earl of Burlington and the kind of Palladians in, and it has a bit more of a manifesto. So I think I would answer that there's an ambiguity. No.
There was another question.
Yeah.
Sorry, did he have much say in the internal arrangements of the house? Did he say we want this room to be most fantastic, or we want this, or did his clients did he have much interaction on that, or was it largely the bigger, wider?
So he was very friendly with the Earl of Carlisle and remained very friendly. The Earl of Carlisle was godfather to his one of his children and was, you know, the signatory when he got married, and he went up and stayed there, and so the presumption is that in 1699 and 1700, i.e. before Hawksmoor is known to have been involved, when the model, I mean, in order to do a model, you've got to know what a building, how a building is going to be, what it's going to look like. And Castle Howard, like Blenheim, was shown off at Kensington so that the king could, you know, have a look at what was planned and proposed. Now, like any house, it's not going to be the architect on their own. It's going to be a discussion. And actually, you know, Castle Howard, the way the plan works, is actually still very ingenious because you have the equivalent of a small, relatively small, not that small, private house in the left-hand wing, and then you have the very nice little colonnade, and then you go into the grand stately mansion. And now, whose idea was that? I mean, the Earl of Carlisle had been to Rome, and he spent, what, 18 months in Rome. He would have been pretty knowledgeable. It's fairly obvious, even though he was very busy at the time Castle Howard was being planned. But these people made time. I mean, to an extent, I hadn't realised the process of the design and gestation of Blenheim is not at all well documented in terms of drawings, but it's incredibly well documented in terms of correspondence, because you can find, I mean, basically, it's known almost kind of certainly week by week between January 1705, the Duke of Marlborough goes to a performance at not at the Queen, at Drury Lane. He meets Vanbrugh and he says a version of, I'm about to be given a big house. can you please explain to me what you're doing at Castle Howard? I mean, I'm inventing it, but it's sort of there in the correspondence. And then Vanbrugh obviously goes away and does quite a bit of work, and then the Duke of Marlborough goes with the Earl of Godolphin, who's First Lord of the Treasury, equivalent Prime Minister, to breakfast. Vanbrugh, fortunately, conveniently, has a bottle of Castle Howard in the goose pie house in one of the rooms. They look at Castle Howard, and the Duke of Marlborough says, it's not quite big enough for what I'm imagining. And would you mind going away and drawing up plans? And they go down to Woodstock Park in late February. The Duke of Marlborough knows that he has to go back to the continent at the end of March. And obviously, he's not going to go back not knowing what the house is going to look like. So it's obvious that Vanbrugh does all the drawings, in that period of 2 months. And as with any building, the Duchess is involved in the discussions as well. It's a version of the ground plan of Castle Howard, but on a bigger scale and with side wings, which kind of create more of a sense of unity.
Thank you.
Yes,
Yeah.
Sarah.
Very, very simple question. I'm fascinated to hear about the models. Do they exist?
No. I sometimes, I still find it strange and a tiny bit frustrating that Blenheim was the equivalent of a state project. And there's just an absolute mountain of correspondence. And then it went to court, not just once, it went to court 3 times. So I'm sure there's more court stuff which I haven't seen, and I suspect hasn't really been gone through in any detail. But you kind of assume there must have been detailed drawings. Where are they? There was a model. Unfortunately, models often, they take up a lot of space.
Mm-hmm.
But Blenheim's a big place. I still, basically all the correspondence was transferred to the British Library in the 70s, and it's there. But I kind of think there probably is, but there won't be a model. I mean, they made a model for the film of The Favourite, and even that just disappeared, even that was only 5 years ago.
One more question.
You mentioned that the theatre was so big that you couldn't hear the actors, and that at Blenheim the rooms were plentiful but tiny, the windows were too high. Do you think he was so obsessed with the theatricality of the exterior that he wasn't really minded to focus on that planning and the internal planning?
I think Castle Howard is actually very well planned, so that it's very adventurous in the way he uses corridors. It's clever in that you have a separate house which you can actually live in, which is a good scale, and then you have a very grand house in which to entertain in. And that is very different from other houses of the time. So that I think he would have been very actively involved, and it's quite different from the ground plan and the way the house is laid out. It's very different from houses of the time. Now that would imply that Vanbrugh, with the Earl of Carlisle, was very involved in the planning of it. In Blenheim, it's partly a problem that it looks so incredibly grand from outside. The criticism is in a way correct, because it's got this extraordinary sense of solidity. And then I can't answer because I don't have as good a sense of the layout of Blenheim, because my experience, because as a member of the public, there's so much about Winston Church. At Castle Howard, I've been there enough over the years to get a feel for the way the ground plan operates. Whereas Blenheim, it changed, it was finished off by the Duchess and so much of the discussion is about her anger and his defense of the cost of it, so that it's not such a good way of understanding the actual process of design. I mean, it's useful talking about it.
Well, thank you very much, Charles. It's been a wonderful, wonderful talk, and to remind everyone that. Sorry, Annie. Sorry, next to you.
In the front row.
I do have a question.
Yeah.
Millions of questions. It was a fabulous lecture. So thank you, Charles. But just actually, you were talking about how he sort of, there are all these people saying horrible things about it, about Blenheim, and then he manages to get all those commissions later on. And that it's because he's in the Kit Kat Club and he's popular and all this kind of thing. But I mean, could you elaborate slightly on that? Because I mean, I'm puzzled by this, to be perfectly honest, because people are so horrible about him, and yet people are willing to spend vast amounts of money commissioning him as well. And it seems slightly strange to me.
So I now think there's, unfortunately, a club aspect to it. The Kit Kat Club was all the grandees of the 1690s. They were very successful, very powerful, and the correspondence. So there's correspondence with the Earl of Manchester, became the Duke of Manchester. There's some correspondence, but not as much as one would like with the Earl of Carlisle. They were both members of the Kit Kat Club. And then there's correspondence with Jacob Thompson, who was the publisher, who basically ran the Kit Kat Club. And the correspondence with Jacob Thompson, you get the feel for a club mentality, which is, it's a gang of people. Vanbrugh had been involved in the invasion. I mean, unfortunately, he spoke too warmly of the prospects of the invasion and was clapped into jail. So, he wasn't actively involved, but he was obviously a big supporter of William. And he was, well, it's obvious from the letters he had the gift of the gab. I mean, and also, so I think he was very good at drawing. I mean, the Earl of Carlisle, everybody thinks, why on earth did the Earl of Carlisle commission Vanbrugh to design an absolutely massive country house for him? Well, the Earl of Carlisle was not a fool. He was just about to be First Lord of the Treasury. He had asked Telman. Telman had charged a huge amount of money, and they'd fallen out, and Telman went to court. Wren didn't want to do it. And Vanbrugh persuaded the Earl of Carlisle that he was the right person to do it. Well, why did he agree to it? He must have agreed to it because he saw that Vanbrugh had this kind of talent and invention. And that's why I found it, I mean, I found it interesting going into the criticism because it's a double-edged thing, that it and not, I mean, Swift, what could have been more annoying for Swift, who's desperate to get a living, who's spent 5 years working for Sir William Temple as his private secretary, waiting to get a living in the UK and in England. And then there's Vanbrugh, who just writes a play with great ease, and then suddenly is a member of the grandest club in London and a friend of the Earl of Halifax and gets all these commissions. It must have been very annoying. I mean, I was interviewed by one of these podcasts and said, what's the relevance of, is there any modern parallel? Well, the fact is that actually Thomas Heatherwick gets under the nose of other architects in the way I think Vanbrugh did, because he gets all the, Google suddenly hires somebody who's not even qualified as an architect. It's bloody annoying. But the reason they do it is because he's very persuasive and because he feels like the new thing. And so, Yeah, I mean, you can't answer it for sure. Yes,
Can I
thanks,
sorry,
Philip.
yeah, follow up, sorry.
I hope this is the first of many discussions between the two of us.
Absolutely. So on top of that, then those later commissions in his life are really interesting post Blenheim because Campbell's come down from Scotland and he's beginning to rally support for Palladianism, and I think very hypocritically he includes Vanbragh's buildings in Vitruvius Britannicus whilst also sort of backchatting it. But you mentioned that there is this slight political angle to the club and to the style. I mean, I find it's more of a statement than a question, really, but I find it very interesting how Vanbrugh does sort of propose a style, which a national style, if you will, which is then superseded by Campbell's sort of coterie. And I find it, I suppose, is it correct that what you're saying that basically the reason that those later patrons go for him is because they know him and he's got the gift of the gab and he's funny and
they're a bit older.
Yeah.
There's a generational thing.
Right.
So that with the third Earl of Carlisle commissions Castlereagh, but the fourth, the Lord Morpeth goes off to Italy in 1715 and is friendly with the Earl of Wellington.
Sure.
And he says it's got to be, it's got to be properly Italian. So that the Temple of the Four Winds is designed in a more orthodox way. And I personally think it's a generational thing. Right. So that the people who had lived through the revolution of 1688, the Whigs, the people who were successful in the 1690s, remained loyal to Vanbrugh, and the next generation all thought it was, overblown.
Thank you.
Well, wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.